Rounding the corner of the Xeno Habitation Ring corridor at a dead sprint, Asmit, security officer, 2nd grade, slid to a stop in the center of the hallway, ears primed and searching for any sound. Only silence waited for him, and the young officer stood for a long second, questioning his sanity. He was sure that he had heard something. A cry of pain had reached out from somewhere down this corridor, distant but unmistakable, and Xisher had come running to help. Now he stood alone, surrounded by towering doorways designed for the other, much larger species of the Federation, and growing increasingly unsure of himself. He had never been the type for flights of wild imagination, but maybe his excitement had gotten the better of him. After all, it was only his 2nd day on the job. Turning to head back to his designated patrol route, Xisher had just begun to reprimand himself when another cry split the silence, and Xisher's blood ran cold. It was the sound of a fellow Melvini in pure, unbridled pain and terror. Xisher had never in his life heard something so primal, so gut-wrenching. No words were distinguishable, but none were needed, even muffled as they were by the door between them. Someone was dying. In an instant, Xisher had bolted down the corridor and practically crashed into the doorway at the end, pawing desperately at the lower of the door's 2 access pads. More terrified wails greeted his ears from the other side as the young Melvini fumbled over his override codes. Just as he was about to force the override of the locks and charge into the room, he stopped, remembering his training, and checked the life support settings of the suite first. The incessant, sharp screams from behind the door kept tearing into him, begging him to act, but Xisher could only recoil in horror at the new barrier preventing him from aiding his tortured kin. The artificial gravity and air pressure beyond the doorway were both cranked up to over 5 times what his tiny species considered normal. Had Xisher gone charging in like he had intended, he would have been pinned to the floor, helpless, and left to suffer whatever horrible fate would have awaited him. Xisher swore and immediately flicked on his comms as he triggered his emergency beacon. His call went through the emergency network to Central Life Support without delay, and he began yelling orders to lower the gravity and atmosphere settings in the hellish suite. Those settings could only be altered from the central hub, and Xisher bellowed and pleaded for urgency as he paced in the corridor. All the while, the screams of agony had never ceased from the other side of the door. As he paced, imploring the life support team to work faster, the tiny security officer accessed station logs and pulled up the suite's occupant information to put out an emergency apprehension bulletin. What he found in the logs shook him to his core. The room was currently occupied by one of the newly contacted Deathworlders. A human. The average Melvini was only half a meter tall, and were often overlooked by the other members of the Federation, but this new giant Xeno had seemed completely enamored by them. The human had come aboard the station earlier in the day and had caused quite the commotion, gushing about the adorable little space hamsters and trying to pet as many of them as possible. Many of the Melvini had been equally as enthused, eager to enjoy the adoration and attention of a much larger species for once, even if said species had been considered scientifically impossible just a few years ago. Another series of screams from behind the door reduced those happy musings to slag in an instant. Xisher continued his pacing, furious that he wasn't able to actually do anything to help. The screaming tore into him, clawing away at his sanity. He focused instead, as much as he was able, on the call with life support, urging them on to move faster. In Xisher's head, the moments seemed to drag on for an eternity as he was forced to listen helplessly, though in reality only a few minutes had passed. All at once, the deadlock broke, and things started to move incredibly fast for Xisher. A notice came through his emergency channel on his compad that the human had been apprehended in the primary mess hall, and was being escorted under guard to his location. They were expected to arrive at the same time as his backup. As Xisher was reading the message, the life support crew called out about their success, and immediately opened the door. Xisher turned, never hesitating, and not having time to ask himself what could possibly be waiting for him if the human was already in custody, and charged into the room. What Xisher found was a scene of absolute carnage. Fur and bits of fluff were scattered all over the suite. It was more fur than the young Melvini thought a member of his species could even grow. Strangely, there was no blood, and no other signs of struggle. There was also no other sign of the victim, and nothing was currently moving other than Xisher. The suite was massive, easily 3 times the size of a normal accommodation on the station's Xeno ring. A huge portion of the far wall was dominated by a window with a commanding view of the moon that was the Melvini homeworld and the gas giant it orbited. The rest of the room was an open floor plan and well lit, with seemingly no place for anyone or anything to be hiding. Most disturbingly, the screams of pain had ceased when the door to the suite had opened. Xisher made his way towards the far corner of the room, gingerly stepping over and around clumps of hair as he went, and made his way over to the bed. The furniture in the suite, designed for Xenos in the 2 to 3 meter range, was far too tall for the horrified security guard to see over, and provided the only real blind spots in the room. Reasoning that the bedding would be the easiest thing to climb, Xisher clambered his way up the side of the bedspread. When he reached the top, he turned and gave the room a thorough examination from his new vantage point. There was nothing to see. Nothing in the room seemed remotely out of order, nothing was hiding in the high places that Xisher couldn't see from the floor, and only the fur-covered carpet belied that anything had ever been wrong. Xisher plopped down on his rear on the overhard mattress and emitted a heavy, confused sigh. Below him, the bed shook. Letting out a startled scream, Xisher was on his feet again instantaneously. A deafening, staccato roar from somewhere beneath the bed shook the very room, and from below him, an alien super-predator burst from under the bed. Xisher stared in mute horror as the enormous monster wheeled in the center of the floor and locked eyes with him. The beast was massive, easily 20 centimeters taller at the shoulder than the tiny Melvini, and wrapped in mottled brown and black fur. There was no mistaking it as anything but a predator. It had forward-facing eyes, huge, pointed ears, and a long snout supporting a massive set of jaws, lined with horrifically sharp teeth, that looked as though they could easily bite Xisher clean in half. Clawed paws on the end of 4 legs supported the creature, and its heavily muscled frame appeared built for speed. It stretched its face towards the bed and the tiny security officer atop it, prying with its nose and incessantly sniffing the air while its large tail waved furiously in a threat display behind it. Not knowing what to do, and cut off from the doorway, Xisher slowly started backing away towards the center of the bed. When the creature didn't react to his retreat, he flicked on his comms again, and started to call for help. As it turned out, that was exactly the wrong thing to do. No sooner had the first sound left Xisher's throat than the monster roared in reply, nearly deafening the young Melvini. Xisher stared, horrified, as the predator dropped the forward half of its body, chest nearly to the floor, ready to pounce, its tail still violently waving in the air. Freezing in place, Xisher became a statue, too afraid to move or make a sound. The beast seemed to only react to him when he moved or spoke, and Xisher hoped that if he did neither of those things, he could somehow survive until his backup arrived. Unfortunately for him, it was his backup that betrayed him. Hearing the commotion over Xisher's open comm channel, someone called out, asking what was happening, their voice carrying clear as day out of the speakers on Xisher's compad. It was the final straw for the super predator, and it unleashed a series of short, sharp roars, all while bouncing around on the floor, and then in one fluid motion, ran and leaped up onto the bed. Xisher fell backwards and screamed, "Ranger! Heal!" Xisher didn't know how long he laid on the bed curled up into a ball, or where the strange voice had come from. It took him several long moments to realize that he wasn't dead before he opened his eyes and tried to figure out what happened. What he found was that his backup had finally arrived. And they had brought the human. She stood in the doorway, towering over the other guards, her hands and restraints in front of her. At her feet, the alien beast sat on its haunches, tongue out and lolling to the side, panting happily. The human did not seem nearly as amused. "What the hell were you doing to my dog?" The implant in his ear thrummed to life, translating the human's question. If Xisher hadn't felt the translator working, he wouldn't have believed what he had just heard. "What am I doing to your dog? I'm investigating a murder!" Xisher screamed, as angry as he had ever been in his life. He leapt from the top of the bed to the floor below, and didn't stop his tirade as he approached the human. That thing murdered an occupant of this station, and I demand that you answer for it. The human blanched at hearing the charges. That can't be. Ranger's too well trained to do anything like that. The denial struck Xisher like a blow, and it sparked a rage in him unlike any he had ever felt before. I heard them dying, he bellowed up at the human. I had to listen to their screams as that thing tore them apart. You dare deny their suffering? You're standing amidst their remains right now. For emphasis, Xisher reached down and grabbed a handful of his deceased brethren's hair from the floor, waving it at the human. The human broke down laughing. Xisher had to double-check that his translator was working properly. His quick diagnostic only confirmed that the human was near hysterical. I'm so sorry, she managed to spit out after calming herself somewhat. This has all been a horrible misunderstanding. Here, let me show you. Before any of the gathered Melvini could protest, the human strode into the room and toward a stack of luggage in the corner. Seemingly unhindered by her restraints, she quickly rummaged through one of the cases and turned back towards the guards. In her hands was a small, relative to the human, stuffed animal. This is one of Ranger's toys. Between prepping for our docking procedures and getting settled in on the station, I haven't had the chance to get Ranger his exercise in a few days. He can get a little antsy when that happens, and he sometimes takes it out on his chew toys. Xisher looked at Ranger, who was still sitting where the human had left him near the door, and the beast only had eyes for the toy that was now in his owner's hands. It certainly seemed like a plausible explanation, and upon further examination, the hair and fluff on the floor wasn't terribly consistent with any known species. No. Not possible. Xisher waved away the explanation, certain that the human was trying to cover something up. I heard someone dying. It was awful. There was no mistaking. What Xisher was planning on saying after that was lost to the room, as the human squeezed the toy in her hand, unleashing the exact same, gut-wrenching cry of pain from the toy that Xisher had been forced to listen to through the door. At the door, Ranger went wild, and darted over to his owner, bouncing eagerly around her as more hideous squeaks erupted from the plushie. Realizing how disturbing the whole scenario must be for the tiny aliens, the human blushed as she tried explaining. We bred dogs from apex predators millennia ago, and some of those killer instincts still run really deep. The squeakers in the toys mimic the sound of dying prey animals. Most dogs go wild for it. I didn't think about how close to home that might land for the Melvini. Without another sound, Xisher turned and walked out of the suite. Putting up with a Deathworlder was one thing, but dealing with trained monsters masquerading as pets? That was too much.